On no tomb that anyone has ever found, what she has is a face. A painted limestone face, smooth, symmetrical, calm, staring out from a museum case in Berlin, visited by more than 1 million people every single year. But in 2006, a team of scientists put that face inside a machine designed to see through solid stone. And what they found underneath the paint was not the same woman the world has been looking at for a century. It was someone else, older, rougher, more human. And once that hidden face was exposed, the story of Queen Nefertiti's bust was never quite the same again. To understand why this discovery mattered, you have to go back to where the bust came from in the first place. In December 1912, a German archaeological team led by Ludwig Borchert was excavating the workshop of a sculptor named Thutmose in the ruins of an ancient Egyptian city called Amarna. Amarna had been built by the pharaoh Akhenaten, the husband of Nefertiti, as a new capital dedicated to the worship of a single sun god, the Aten. It was one of the strangest and most radical periods in Egyptian history, a brief religious revolution that broke almost every rule of traditional Egyptian art and belief. Inside Thutmose's workshop, buried under centuries of sand and rubble, Borchert's team uncovered a bust of a woman wearing a tall, flat-topped blue crown. Her neck was long and elegant, her cheekbones were sharp, her lips were painted a deep red, and one of her eyes was fitted with an inlay of rock crystal, while the other socket remained empty, never filled in. It was immediately clear that this was not a rough sketch or a discarded practice piece. It was an extraordinarily refined, finished work of art. And it was almost certainly meant to serve as a master model, a reference piece that other sculptors in the workshop would copy when producing official images of the queen. The bust left Egypt under an agreement that split archaeological finds between the excavating country and the Egyptian government. Debated for over a century, and it remains one of the most persistent points of tension between Egypt and Germany. The bust arrived in Berlin, and for years it was kept largely out of public view, passed between private collections and museum storage. It wasn't until 1924 that it was finally put on public display, and the effect was immediate. The bust became a sensation. It was held up as the definitive image of ancient beauty, reproduced on postcards, posters, and eventually in countless textbooks. Adolf Hitler is reported to have called it a unique treasure and refused to allow it to be returned to Egypt during the 1930s, even as Egyptian officials pushed for its repatriation. That refusal set a precedent that essentially still holds today. The bust has remained in Germany for over a century, moving between museums in Berlin depending on the political situation, surviving the bombing of the city during the Second World War inside a bank vault, and eventually settling into its current home at the Neues Museum, where a special climate-controlled room was built specifically to display it. Egypt has continued to formally request its return for decades, and Germany has continued to decline, arguing that the original export was legally conducted under the laws and agreements of the time. For most of the 20th century, the world only ever saw the outside of the bust. Nobody was allowed to touch it, and for a long time, even close photography was restricted. The Egyptian Museum in Berlin treated it less like an artifact and more like a national treasure that had to be protected from every possible risk, including the risk of scientific damage from any kind of physical sampling. That protectiveness is actually part of why the internal structure of the bust remained a mystery for so long. Scientists wanted answers, but nobody was willing to drill into a 3,000-year-old masterpiece to get them. Three-dimensional map of everything inside, layer by layer, without cutting into anything or causing any damage. It is the same basic technology used to look inside the human body, and it turned out to be exactly the tool needed to finally look inside Nefertiti without touching her. The first real attempt came in 1992, when the bust was given an early CT scan. The technology at the time was limited compared to what exists today, but it was enough to reveal that the bust was not a solid, single block of stone. Instead, it had been built in layers, an approach that ancient Egyptian sculptors were known to use for certain types of formal portraiture. But the 1992 scan raised more questions than it answered, and the resolution simply wasn't good enough to map the internal structure in real detail. That changed in 2006, when researchers returned with vastly improved equipment. Alexander Huppertz, who headed the Imaging Science Institute in Berlin, worked together with Dietrich Wildung, who was then director of Berlin's Egyptian Museum, to conduct a new and far more advanced scan. They used a Siemens Somatom Sensation, a 64-slice CT scanner, one of the highest resolution medical imaging machines available at the time. A National Geographic television crew documented the process, and the results were eventually featured in a National Geographic Channel special. The scan allowed the researchers to essentially X-ray the entire bust, slice by slice, building a complete three-dimensional model of its internal structure without so much as touching the surface. What the scan revealed rewrote the accepted understanding of how the bust was made. The core of the sculpture, it turned out, was carved from a single block of limestone, shaped into a rough but recognizable likeness of a woman's face and neck. This limestone core was not smooth or idealized. It had visible asymmetries. There were wrinkles around the eyes and at the corners of the mouth. There was a noticeable bump along the bridge of the nose. The cheeks were less full, the structure less flawless than the face the entire world had come to recognize. On top of this rougher limestone core, the ancient sculptor had applied layers of plaster. In other words, the famous face of Nefertiti is not a direct portrait. It is a mask, a remarkably skilled cosmetic reconstruction, built directly over the top of what appears to be a more accurate, more human depiction of the queen's actual features. Bildung himself noted that the painted plaster face is not necessarily very representative of what Nefertiti truly looked like, and that the limestone core underneath may actually hold greater value for anyone trying to understand her real appearance. This idea lines up with what historians already knew about the artistic culture of the Amarna period. Portraiture during Akhenaten's reign was closely tied to religious and political messaging. The royal family was frequently depicted in ways that emphasized divine perfection, symbolic symmetry, and idealized serenity, rather than strict physical accuracy. If the Thutmose workshop was producing a master reference bust meant to define how Nefertiti would be portrayed across the kingdom, it makes sense that the artists would have started with a realistic study and then deliberately refined it into something more symbolic, more perfect, more suited to royal propaganda. This finding also mattered for a completely different reason. It gave scientists a much stronger basis for confirming that the bust is authentic. Ever since the bust rose to global fame, occasional claims have surfaced suggesting it might be a modern forgery, created sometime in the early 20th century rather than in ancient Egypt. These claims never gained serious traction among Egyptologists, but they resurfaced periodically in the press. In 2009, when a documentary once again raised the forgery theory, Bildung publicly dismissed it as nothing more than a publicity stunt. He pointed to the layered internal structure revealed by the CT scans, the specific plaster and stoneworking techniques consistent with known ancient Egyptian workshop practices, and the results of detailed radiological and material analysis, all of which supported the bust's authenticity rather than undermining it. That material analysis has its own long history, separate from the CT scans but reinforcing the same conclusion. As early as 1923, a chemist named Friedrich Rathgen analyzed the pigments used to paint the bust, comparing them to known pigment samples from other confirmed 18th dynasty Egyptian artworks. His findings, published in Ludwig Borchardt's own book on the discovery, showed that the pigments matched what was known to be used by artisans during Nefertiti's era. Decades later, in 1982, researchers at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology repeated and confirmed this pigment analysis using far more advanced chemical techniques than had been available in the 1920s, and the results held up. The colors on Nefertiti's face, the deep reds, the blues of her crown, all of it chemically matched genuine ancient Egyptian material, not any pigment or process that would have been used by a hypothetical early 20th century forger. So by the time the 2006 CT scan results were published, there were now two completely independent lines of scientific evidence, one chemical and one structural, both pointing firmly in the same direction. The bust is not a forgery. It is a genuine 3,000-year-old artifact, and it is not a single, simple sculpture. It is a layered, engineered work of art, with a more human, imperfect face hidden directly beneath the polished, idealized one that made it famous. The scientific story could have ended there, but the bust's saga took another unexpected turn a decade later, this time driven not by archaeologists, but by artists. In 2016, a German-Iraqi artist named Nora al-Badri and a German artist named John Nikolai Nellis announced that they had secretly conducted their own three-dimensional scan of the bust inside the Neues Museum, without the museum's authorization, and had released the resulting digital file to the public for free download. They framed the act as a form of cultural repatriation, arguing that if the physical bust could not be returned to Egypt, then at the very least, a perfect digital copy should belong to everyone, especially the Egyptian public, rather than remaining locked away as the exclusive property of a German state museum. Part of their argument rested on the fact that the museum had never released its own official scan data to the public, and had even prohibited ordinary visitors from photographing the bust for years. The story became more complicated a month later, when questions arose about whether the scan the artist released was genuinely captured by hidden equipment inside the museum, as they had originally claimed, or whether it had actually been obtained through unauthorized access to the museum's own internal digital files. The artists never directly confirmed or denied which version was true, and the ambiguity became part of the ongoing controversy and mystery surrounding their project. Regardless of the method, the episode put direct pressure on the museum and on the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation, the German institution that oversees Berlin's state museums, including the one housing the bust. A researcher named Cosmo Wenman took up the cause starting around 2016, using Germany's Freedom of Information laws to formally request that the foundation release its own official, high-resolution scan data of the bust to the public. According to Wenman, the foundation initially resisted, offering only limited, supervised access rather than a full public release, an approach he later described as treating the scan like a closely guarded state secret. Wenman kept pressing the case for years. After a legal and bureaucratic effort that stretched on for roughly 3 years, the foundation finally agreed to release the official three-dimensional scan files of the Nefertiti bust to the public, a milestone that was confirmed and reported in late 2025. Taken together, these two threads, the 2006 CT scan and the more recent battle over public access to accurate digital scan data, tell a fuller story about the bust than either one does alone. One thread is about what is physically inside the sculpture, a rougher, more human face, carved first in stone and then deliberately reshaped into an idealized royal image through careful layers of plaster. The other thread is about who controls access to that information and how long it can take, even in the modern era of open data and digital archiving, for the public to gain full and transparent access to the true structure of an object that captivates millions of people every year. What makes the internal discovery so compelling is not simply that scientists found a technical detail about ancient sculpting methods. It is what that detail implies about Nefertiti herself and about how image-making functioned in her world. The woman the public has celebrated for a century as an eternal standard of beauty was, underneath the surface, someone with visible wrinkles, an asymmetrical face, an ass, and a nose with a distinct bump, someone who looked more like an actual human being who aged and lived a real life rather than a flawless icon. The ancient artist who worked in Thutmose's workshop appears to have first studied her real features closely enough to capture them accurately in stone, and only afterward transformed that accurate study into the polished, symbolic version meant for public and religious display. That two-step process, real observation first, followed by deliberate idealization, mirrors something people still do today, whether through retouched photography or carefully managed public images, except this version was carried out with plaster and pigment more than 3,000 years ago. It also reframes what the Nefertiti bust actually represents as an object. For 100 years, people walking into that quiet, climate-controlled room in the Neues Museum have been looking at what they assumed was simply a portrait, a direct window into the face of a real Egyptian queen. The 2006 scan suggests something more layered and more interesting. The bust functioned as both portrait and propaganda simultaneously, a technical masterpiece designed to project an idealized, divine version of royal beauty. One also, while quietly preserving, buried just beneath the surface, a far more honest record of what Nefertiti may have actually looked like. In a strange way, both faces are true at the same time. The polished one facing outward tells you how Nefertiti wanted to be seen, or how the religious and political culture of Amarna wanted her to be seen. The rougher one, hidden inside, tells you something closer to how she actually appeared. That duality is part of why the story keeps resurfacing more than a decade after the original scan, and why people keep returning to it. It isn't really about a single dramatic secret waiting to be uncovered once and never discussed again. It's about the fact that modern imaging technology gave researchers a way to look past 3,000 years of careful artistic construction and public mythology straight down to the raw material underneath. And what they found down there wasn't a scandal or a hoax. It was simply a more human version of one of the most idealized faces in history. A queen with wrinkles and an imperfect nose, hidden for millennia beneath a mask of painted plaster, waiting for a machine sensitive enough to finally see through it. So here's the question worth sitting with before you close this video. If a face that has been stared at by more people than almost any other face in human history can hide a completely different version of itself just a few millimeters beneath the surface, how much of what we accept as fact in history and science and the images we're shown every single day is actually the polished plaster and not the stone underneath it? That's not a rhetorical throwaway line. That's genuinely the reason stories like this one matter, and it's the reason this channel exists. To dig past the version of history that gets repeated without question and get down to what the actual evidence says, even when that evidence complicates the picture we thought we already understood. If this kind of story is the kind of thing you want more of, the single most useful thing you can do right now is hit subscribe, because this channel is built entirely around exactly this kind of investigation. Cases where modern science, modern technology, or newly released records force us to look again at objects and stories we assumed were already fully explained. Nefertiti's bust is one example out of a huge number of similar cases sitting in museums, archives, and excavation sites right now, still waiting for someone to ask the right question or run the right scan. If you want to be there when the next one gets uncovered, Subscribing is how you make sure you don't miss it, because these stories don't always trend the way they should, and the algorithm doesn't always put them in front of you unless you've already told it you care. While you're at it, tap the like button on this video. I know that sounds like a small, almost meaningless request, but it genuinely determines whether a video like this one gets shown to other people who would find it just as interesting as you did. A well-researched piece like this one lives or dies in terms of reach on those first few minutes of engagement. If you found even one part of this surprising, whether it was the hidden wrinkles under the plaster, the bump on the nose that got smoothed away, or the decade-long fight just to get the museum's own scan data released to the public, that reaction is worth a single tap. It costs you nothing, and it's the difference between this research reaching a few thousand people or a few 100,000 people who would otherwise never hear this version of the story. I also want to hear from you directly, so drop a comment below. Tell me which part of this actually surprised you. Was it the idea that the most famous face in ancient art isn't even the real face? That it's a constructed, idealized mask built directly over a rougher, more human sculpture? Was it the fact that the museum sat on its own scan data for years, treating a piece of publicly funded research almost like classified information, until one researcher spent 3 years forcing it into the open through freedom of information law? Or maybe it was simply the fact that this bust, this exact object sitting in Berlin right now, has been at the center of an unresolved argument between two countries for over a century, an argument that still hasn't been settled. Whatever it was, say so in the comments, because those comments genuinely shape what gets covered next. I read them, I use them to figure out which threads people actually want pulled further, and some of the best future videos on this channel have come directly out of comment sections, not out of my own idea list. And if you want to take this a step further, don't just take my word for any of this, go look at the actual CT scan images yourself. Search for the 2006 study conducted by Alexander Huppertz and the Imaging Science Institute in Berlin, or look up the National Geographic documentary that first brought those scan results to a wider audience. Go. Read about Cosmo Wenman's freedom of information fight, and look at the official three-dimensional scan files that were finally released to the public after that 3-year effort. Part of the reason misinformation spreads so easily around ancient artifacts is that most people only ever encounter secondhand summaries, filtered through headlines designed to grab attention rather than inform. You now know enough to go find the primary sources yourself, and I genuinely encourage you to do exactly that, because seeing the actual scan data with your own eyes is a completely different experience than just hearing someone describe it. This is also a good moment to think about what this story says beyond just one bust in one museum. Every statue, every painted portrait, every carefully staged historical image you've ever accepted as simple fact was made by someone with intentions, with an agenda, with an audience in mind. Nefertiti's sculptor didn't set out to deceive anyone in some malicious sense. He was doing exactly what he was commissioned to do, building an idealized image of royal divine perfection for religious and political purposes. But the fact remains that for 100 years, millions of visitors stood in front of that bust in Berlin, convinced they were looking at an untouched direct record of a real woman's face, when in fact they were looking at a carefully engineered mask. That gap between what an image claims to show and what actually lies beneath it is worth remembering the next time you're presented with any polished, confident, widely accepted version of history. If you made it this far, you clearly care about getting the real story instead of the surface-level version, and that puts you in a small group of people who actually want depth instead of just another retelling of the same tired headline. So make the most of that. Subscribe, so the next investigation, like this one, reaches you directly. Like the video, so it reaches someone else who would value it just as much as you did. Drop a comment with the artifact, mystery, or historical claim you want examined next, using the same standard of evidence you just saw applied here. And go check the sources for yourself, because the moment you start verifying claims instead of just accepting them, you stop being someone who gets told history, and you start being someone who actually understands it. Thank you for watching all the way through, and I'll see you in the next one, where we'll be pulling back another layer that history tried very hard to keep hidden.